Something is happening to Gen X men that most people are misreading. They are answering fewer calls, declining invitations, leaving work events early, spending more time alone in garages, workshops, backyards, or on quiet roads where nobody needs anything from them. Their families may call it withdrawal. Their coworkers may call it disengagement. But many of these men are not turning away from life. They are turning away from a deal that no longer makes sense. Sacrifice everything now, wait until retirement to live, and hope your body survives long enough to enjoy what remains. They have heard too many stories about the man who worked for 40 years, retired on Friday, and was dead before Christmas. They know someone who postponed every trip, every hobby, and every peaceful morning until later, only to discover it later came with heart medication, chronic pain, or a diagnosis that changed everything. Retirement did not necessarily kill these people, but the habit of postponing life may have quietly taken more from them than anyone realized. Stephen is 56 years old. He has worked in operations for 33 years. For most of his adult life, his alarm has gone off at 4:45 in the morning. He drives to work before sunrise, unlocks problems that somebody else created, and spends the day keeping an organization functioning, while younger executives talk about innovation as though experience were an inconvenience. Stephen was never lazy. He never expected life to be easy. Working 60 or 70 hours a week was not something he complained about. It was proof that he could be counted on. He stayed late when equipment failed. He covered shifts when other people called in sick. He missed birthdays because the company needed him. He believed loyalty would eventually become security. Then he watched the company promote a man 20 years younger and asked Stephen to train him. The new manager used phrases like cultural alignment and resistance to change. Stephen understood what those phrases meant. His experience was valuable enough to extract, but his presence was becoming expensive. After 3 decades of being indispensable, he was slowly being treated like an outdated part that had not yet been removed. Work was only one side of his life. His 83-year-old father needed help getting to medical appointments. The house required repairs that could no longer be postponed. His adult children called when a car broke down, a payment was late, or a decision had gone wrong. Stephen was the emergency number for everyone, but he could not remember the last time somebody called simply to ask how he was doing. Nobody intended to destroy him. That was what made the situation so difficult to explain. Each individual request sounded reasonable. One more shift, one more loan, one more favor, one more weekend surrendered. But when those requests were stacked across 30 years, they became an entire life consumed in small, socially acceptable pieces. Then a coworker named Paul retired after almost 4 decades with the company. At the retirement party, everyone congratulated him. They joked about fishing, sleeping late, and finally enjoying himself. Paul smiled, held the plaque they had given him, and said he was ready to begin the best chapter of his life. 6 months later, Stephen attended his funeral. Driving home, Stephen did not decide that retirement had killed Paul. He realized something more disturbing. Paul had spent most of his life waiting for permission to live, and when that permission finally arrived, there was almost no life left in which to use it. That night, Stephen sat alone in his garage long after everyone had gone to bed. He looked at the tools he had not touched in years and the motorcycle he kept promising himself he would restore after retirement. He suddenly hated those 2 words, after retirement. Why was peace scheduled for 11 years from now? Why did freedom have to wait until his body was exhausted? Who had guaranteed that he would reach the age printed on his retirement plan? And if he continued giving everyone the strongest parts of himself, what exactly would be left when the paycheck finally stopped? Stephen did not announce a dramatic transformation. Gen X men rarely do. He simply began withdrawing his participation from things that were draining him. He stopped attending optional company gatherings where everyone performed enthusiasm. He no longer answered work messages late at night unless a genuine emergency existed. He began letting calls go to voicemail. He spent Saturday mornings alone and discovered that silence felt better than conversation that always ended with another obligation. People noticed. His coworkers said he was checking out. His family said he had become distant. Someone told him that he seemed angry, but Stephen was not angry. He was tired of being available to everyone except himself. The most painful moment came when his son asked him to withdraw money from his retirement account to solve another financial problem. In the past, Stephen would have agreed. He had spent years protecting the people he loved from the consequences of their choices, even when doing so damaged his own future. This time, he calmly said no. He did not insult his son. He did not lecture him. He simply explained that he could offer advice, but he could not sacrifice his remaining security. The calls became less frequent after that. A family member accused Stephen of caring more about money than his own children. Another said he had changed. They were right. He had changed. For the first time, he was asking whether the people around him loved him or merely loved the access they had to his time, money, labor, and emotional strength. That question can break something open inside a man. Many Gen X men were taught that their worth came from usefulness. They learned to repair, provide, protect, absorb pressure, and remain silent. They became the person everyone leaned on. But when a man is valued primarily for what he carries, putting the burden down can feel like disappearing from other people's lives. This is one reason isolation begins to feel safe. After decades of constant demands, the nervous system starts treating silence like shelter. A locked garage, a quiet cabin, an empty road, or a morning without notifications becomes the only place where a man is not required to perform competence. He does not have to prove his value there. He does not have to manufacture enthusiasm for another meaningless initiative. He does not have to rescue anyone. He does not have to explain why he is tired. He can simply exist. But this is also where the story becomes dangerous, because there are two very different ways for a man to disappear. The first is to keep showing up for everyone until nothing remains inside him. He still goes to work. He still pays the bills. He still says that he is fine. From the outside, he appears responsible and dependable. Inside, the person he once was has already vanished. The second is to step back deliberately, protect what remains, and decide who and what still deserves access to his life. One form of disappearance is surrender. The other may be the beginning of recovery. Stephen is now standing between those two possibilities. He refuses to spend another decade dying slowly at work, while waiting for retirement to grant him permission to live. But he also senses that peaceful solitude can become destructive loneliness if he closes every door and allows nobody to notice whether he is still there. So the real question is not whether Gen X men should withdraw. The question is what they need to withdraw from, who they must keep close, and what they must begin building before the silence they desperately need becomes the isolation that consumes them. The answer begins by recognizing the difference between hiding from life and protecting yourself long enough to rebuild it. Solitude can help a man hear his own thoughts after decades of living inside other people's demands. Isolation becomes dangerous when the silence no longer restores him, when every relationship is treated as a threat, and when nobody would notice if he stopped showing up. One is a boundary, the other is a disappearance. Stephen realized that he did not need to choose between being consumed by everyone and cutting himself off from everyone. There was a third path. He could become more selective. He could stop giving unlimited access to people who only contacted him during emergencies, while remaining open to the few who cared about the person beneath the provider. He began by making an honest inventory of his life. Not a retirement spreadsheet. Not another list of financial targets. He wrote down the names of the people, obligations, and routines that left him depleted. Then, he wrote down the things that made him feel present, even if only for a few minutes. The first list was long. The second list was almost empty. That emptiness frightened him, but it also revealed the truth. Stephen had spent so many years being useful that he had forgotten what it felt like to be alive without producing something for somebody else. For decades, he had functioned as the family emergency department. Every mistake became his crisis. Every shortage became his responsibility. Every conflict eventually arrived at his door. He had confused being needed with being loved, because being needed was the most consistent form of affection he had received. So he established a new rule. He would support the people he loved, but he would not repeatedly save them from consequences they were capable of facing themselves. That distinction changed everything. When his son experienced another financial problem, Stephen offered to sit down, review the numbers, and help create a plan. He offered his knowledge, attention, and experience, but he did not offer his retirement account. His son was disappointed. Other family members still considered Stephen selfish, but he remained calm because he finally understood that another person's disappointment did not automatically mean he had done something wrong. This is one of the hardest lessons for a man who has spent his life providing. The moment he creates a boundary, the people who benefited from his lack of boundaries may experience it as rejection. They may become angry. They may withdraw affection. They may tell him he has changed, and perhaps he has. Change is not always betrayal. Sometimes change is what happens when a man realizes that continuing in the same direction will destroy him. A healthy boundary does not say, "I no longer care about you." It says, "I will not destroy myself to prove that I care about you." It leaves the door open to connection, but closes the door to exploitation. It allows love to exist without requiring endless rescue. Stephen applied the same principle at work. He did not quit in anger or deliver a dramatic speech. He continued doing his job well, but he quietly retired from the performance surrounding it. He stopped volunteering for unnecessary emergencies. He stopped staying late to protect managers from their own poor planning. He no longer pretended that every corporate initiative was a historic mission. He offered his experience when it was respected, but he stopped begging an organization to recognize the value it had relied upon for 3 decades. This was not laziness. It was proportion. The company paid for his labor during certain hours. It did not own his evenings, his nervous system, or the remaining years of his life. Stephen had once considered constant availability a symbol of character. Now he understood that character also meant keeping promises to himself. He began taking small portions of his future back before retirement arrived. On Wednesday evenings, he turned off his work phone and entered the garage. He pulled the cover from the motorcycle he had promised to restore someday. For years, someday had been a storage room where he placed every desire that could not serve somebody else. Now he worked on the motorcycle one piece at a time. He did not need to finish it quickly. He did not turn the project into a business. He did not create a schedule, measure his productivity, or search for a way to monetize it. The work mattered because it belonged entirely to him. That may sound small, but for a man who has lived according to obligation, doing something without needing to justify its usefulness can feel revolutionary. Stephen also knew that a garage could become a sanctuary or a prison. If he wanted solitude without disappearing, he needed 3 anchors: one person, one place, and one purpose. The first anchor was one person with whom he could speak honestly. Stephen called a former coworker named Thomas. They had spent years solving problems together, but had rarely discussed anything personal. Stephen asked if he wanted to meet for breakfast. There was no emotional confession and no dramatic conversation. They drank coffee, complained briefly about their knees, talked about old machinery, and laughed about mistakes they had made 20 years earlier. They agreed to meet again the following month. That breakfast did not solve Stephen's life. It did something quieter and perhaps more important. It placed one event on his calendar where he was not an employee, a father, a son, or an emergency contact. He was simply a man sitting across from another man who understood some of what he had carried. A person does not always need dozens of friends. Sometimes he needs one person who will notice when he is absent. The second anchor was one place where Stephen could appear regularly. He found a community workshop that allowed people to use tools, repair equipment, and teach basic mechanical skills. At first, he kept to himself. Then someone asked for help with an engine problem. Stephen showed him what to look for without taking the entire project away from him. The next week, the man remembered Stephen's name. That small moment mattered. Stephen was no longer invisible, but he was also not being consumed. His knowledge had value there, yet nobody expected him to carry the whole building on his back. The third anchor was a purpose that did not depend upon fear. For most of his life, Stephen's purpose had been avoiding disaster. Keep the company running, keep the mortgage paid, keep the family stable, keep everyone safe. Fear can make a man extremely productive, but it cannot give him peace. His new purpose was simpler. He wanted to preserve useful knowledge and pass it to people who genuinely wanted to learn. He could teach without controlling, help without rescuing, and contribute without surrendering himself. This is what many discussions about retirement overlook. A man does not only lose a paycheck when he leaves work, he can lose structure, identity, movement, recognition, and the daily evidence that somebody expects him to arrive. If nothing replaces those things, freedom can slowly become emptiness. That is why the goal should not be merely to retire from something. It should be to move toward something. That something does not need to impress anyone. It might be restoring furniture, caring for animals, coaching, volunteering, building a garden, learning an instrument, repairing old machines, or meeting the same group of people for a morning walk. Purpose does not need a salary or a job title. It only needs to give a person a reason to participate in tomorrow. Stephen started moving his body again as well, not to become young, punish himself, or prove anything. He walked because he wanted his body to remain part of his life rather than become the vehicle that transported him between a chair, a car, and a desk. He began sleeping more consistently. He scheduled medical appointments he had postponed. He ate lunch away from his computer. These were not glamorous acts of rebellion, but they sent an important message to his nervous system. His health was no longer the first resource to be sacrificed whenever life became demanding. There were still days when Stephen wanted to shut every door. Solitude felt easier than explaining himself, but he learned to recognize the warning signs that restoration was turning into isolation. If every invitation irritated him, he asked why. If several days passed without a meaningful conversation, he contacted Thomas. If the garage stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling empty, he went to the community workshop. If anger became the only emotion he could access, he did not romanticize it as independence. Real independence includes knowing when to seek connection. There is no shame in talking with a trusted friend, a support group, or a qualified professional when the weight becomes too heavy. A generation trained to survive alone may interpret asking for help as weakness, but refusing every form of support does not make a man stronger. It only guarantees that he carries pain without witnesses. Stephen also began thinking differently about retirement. It was no longer a magical date when his real life would suddenly begin. It was a transition he could prepare for emotionally, socially, physically, and financially. He considered whether he could reduce his hours before leaving completely. He calculated what enough actually meant, instead of allowing fear to move the finish line forever. He thought about what his weeks would look like when there was no supervisor, alarm, or urgent message, deciding how he spent them. Most importantly, he stopped postponing every meaningful experience until that date. He took a short trip. He repaired part of the motorcycle. He watched the sunrise without checking his messages. He visited his father because he chose to, not because guilt demanded it. He offered his son guidance without purchasing peace between them. Some relationships adjusted. Others remained distant. Stephen learned that healing does not always restore every relationship. Sometimes it reveals which relationships were capable of becoming healthy and which ones depended upon the old version of him remaining exhausted. He did not celebrate that loss, but he stopped chasing people who only returned when he agreed to abandon himself. This is the deeper reason some Gen X men are quietly isolating now. They are not necessarily waiting to die. They are refusing to spend the years before retirement rehearsing their own disappearance. They have begun to understand that strength is not measured only by how much pressure a man can absorb. It is also measured by whether he knows when enough is enough. Discipline is not merely waking before sunrise and working through pain. Discipline can mean leaving work on time, protecting retirement savings, caring for the body, refusing a destructive request, and maintaining a few honest connections even when isolation feels safer. A man does not need to hate society to stop participating in its most exhausting expectations. He does not need to abandon his family to establish limits. He does not need to move into the wilderness to reclaim his life. Sometimes quietly walking away means leaving the argument, not the people. It means giving up the role of permanent rescuer. It means refusing to audition for approval. It means allowing silence to reveal which parts of life were real and which parts were maintained only by fear. Stephen is still 56. He has not solved every problem, and he has not reached retirement. But he no longer feels as though his life is located somewhere in the distant future. He has fewer obligations now, but more presence. Fewer people have unlimited access to him, but the relationships that remain are more honest. He is no longer trying to be needed by everyone. He is learning how to be known by a few. That is not a man waiting to die. That is a man who finally understands that the remaining years of his life are not leftovers. If you have also begun withdrawing, ask yourself one honest question. Are you escaping life? Or are you clearing enough space to build one that finally belongs to you? Share your story in the comments. Tell us what you are quietly removing from your life and what you hope to place there instead. Someone reading your words may realize that he is not the only one standing at this turning point. And in the next video, we will explore the things Gen X men are quietly removing after 50, not because they have stopped caring, but because they have finally learned that peace also deserves protection.